Hello, Bio 130 students, and today we are going to do the nervous system, part 1. The nervous system consists of, for this class, two main regions, which are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, or CNS, is going to be the parts of the nervous system that lie mainly in the cranial and spinal cavities. And the peripheral nervous system is what lies, for the most part, outside the spinal cavity and the cranial cavity. And there will be four terms which are very, very similar. For the central nervous system, there's going to be nucleus and tract, and then for the peripheral nervous system, ganglion and nerve. Now, essentially, nucleus and tract, they're effectively the same thing, as well as ganglion and nerve. It just depends on whether we're talking about the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. For the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system, the nucleus or the ganglion is essentially where a large collection of neuron cell bodies are. So neuron cells are, whereas tract or nerve is essentially where there are a bundle of axons. Now, axons can be called white matter, whereas gray matter is what a group of neuron cell bodies are. And the basic image on the left is really just to show that central nervous system, predominantly when we're looking at the brain or the nervous system in the spinal column, and then the peripheral nervous system is effectively the rest of your nervous system throughout the rest of your body. Now, nervous tissue of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system consists of two cell types: glial cells, which essentially provide a scaffold and a framework for supporting neurons and their functions of sending signals or interpreting sensory information. Neurons are the second type of cell, and these are the ones involved in communication, what you might typically think of what the nervous system does. Neurons, they are cells in your body. They look quite different than many of your other cells, but like any true cell, neurons do in fact have a nucleus, they do have mitochondria, they do have ribosomes, they do have organelles. They also have what's called a soma, which is a cell body of a neuron. So essentially looking at the casing housing that cell. And unique to neuron cells are what are called processes. These are physical structures that are extensions of the cell body. And there are two types. There are axons, which are essentially connective fibers that go between a neuron and its target, usually a neuron terminal or, extending to other parts of the body. Whereas dendrites, these are extensions of a neuron cell, which are better at sending signals quickly between nearby neurons. And to better show this, the picture on the far right, essentially dendrites are the little wires that are branching out at different corners of this neuron cell body, whereas the axon all the way at the bottom of that image is the more longer, thicker extension. And axons typically will be covered more in fat, which is why they're part of white matter, or why they're called white matter, because of the higher amount of fat around axons. Gray matter is simply regions where there are many cell bodies, as well as dendrites, because those are very close to the cell body, whereas white matter is where there are regions of a high collection of axon extensions. And again, it's white matter because there's a lot of fatty encasing around axons. And just another simple way of looking at it, effectively the edges of the brain could be called the gray matter, where there are plenty of cell bodies, whereas the internal parts of the brain, where the majority of the brain's volume, physical volume, comes from, is from white matter, or where the axons are bundling together. Gray matter, so the cell bodies, these are what are in charge of actually processing information, whether it is the sensory information received through eyes, the nose, hearing, sense of touch, things like that kind of information, or interpreting information from signals throughout your body. Whereas the white matter, the bundles of axons, those are more for allowing communication between the gray matter and other more distant gray matter neurons that are farther apart from each other, as well as between neurons/gray matter and the rest of your body, such as your hand or sensory information from your hand and feet going through to get back to your brain to be interpreted properly. Brain is interesting in that your cell bodies, your neuron cell bodies, the actual cells themselves, they finish developing typically around a human person's 20s, whereas the gray matter, they develop throughout the 20s up till middle age. So really, in your 20s, you are nearing finishing a fully developed brain, which is why it seems like during those high school years, there's a lot of more prone to mood swings or other things like that. To not have a better word for it, more unstable in emotions. Well, your brain's not fully developed during your high school years, and it's actually still changing and physically even restructuring its physical structure. But by your 20s, normally that is where your moods become more stable, more composed, better at handling stress, things like that. All because your brain is literally physically stabilizing. Discrete structures, well, like it was said before, the nervous system and the peripheral system, they essentially have the same parts, but different terminology is used depending on whether you're talking about cell bodies or axons in the central nervous system, the brain and spinal column specifically, or the peripheral system, other parts of the body. And if you're looking at a collection of neuron cells, of cell bodies, well, in the central nervous system, that'd be called a nucleus. Whereas in the peripheral nervous system, those collection of cell bodies would be called a ganglion. And then as far as what bundles of axon extensions are, well, central nervous system, those would be called tracts, whereas in the peripheral nervous system, they would be called nerves. And just to illustrate that, tract and nerve or nucleus and ganglion, there's no real physical differentiation. It just depends on, it's just an arbitrary distinction of whether we're looking at the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. For example, looking at this picture of the brain and the eyes closest to the eyes, those axons are the optic nerve. And then as you get closer toward the internal parts of the brain or the central nervous system, the optic nerve seamlessly transitions into the optic tract. It's the same wiring, it's just if we're more toward the peripheral end of the nervous system, then the terminology is nerve, whereas if you're looking more toward the central nervous system, that same wiring would just be called a tract. There's no real noticeable difference between when a nerve stops and when a tract begins. And similarly for nucleus and ganglion. It's just if we're talking about central nervous system or peripheral nervous system, and it's an arbitrary distinction. No real meaningfully physical distinction. And that essentially concludes really different parts of the nervous system. Now we're going to get into some actual medical techniques for looking at the nervous system. Throughout human anatomy, it's likely we'll see diseases, but we're also able to talk about and discuss different medical techniques for studying different body systems. And one such for studying the brain in particular is magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, which is a very powerful tool for distinguishing variations in the structure of, say, the brain, the physical structure. And this is done so by essentially analyzing with magnetic fields and then using that to observe the different atomic nuclei in the brain. And an atomic nuclei is simply, say, a hydrogen atom, a carbon atom, things like that, which for the most part you'll be looking, or an MRI can also be called in chemistry proton NMR, proton nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. Effectively, it just looks at the different types of environments hydrogen is in, whether it's bound to, say, carbon or hydrogen bound to oxygen, variations like that. And let's see, fatty tissue and water appear as different shades of black and white because of the various environments that hydrogen is experiencing. And since water and fat are very easy to distinguish, MRI is very good at distinguishing gray matter versus the more fattier white matter. So, for example, here is a scan through an MRI. We'll talk about some other types of scanning, but an MRI is very excellent if a medical professional wants to look at the structure and wants a very detailed image of the current structural layout of the brain. And with an MRI, the edges are going to be what are the nucleus or the cell bodies, whereas the more fattier bundles of axons, the white matter, when you're looking at the brain, the white matter is more in the center of the image. Now, we'll get into other types of medical scannings in the next lesson video, but as far as, let's get into actual functions of the nervous system. And, well, basic functions: sensation, receiving and interpreting information, sensory information, forming responses to that information, integrating that information and into how the body responds. And, well, another main function is actually controlling the body. Well, which is very important for actually moving around, or in a not typical way of thinking about it, controlling the body's different organs to properly do what they have to do. And when it comes to controlling the body, there are two ways to break that down: somatic and autonomic nervous systems. But getting into the functions of the nervous system: sensation, which is really the receiving of information from our environment. And these can be sensory functions, both external and internal. For example, seeing information through sight in your eyes or listening, and your nervous system taking each of those components of information and combining it together. But also, it could be internal. Say, parts of your hands are, say, your body temperature is getting cold, then your brain can interpret that information as it's time to start concentrating the internal heat of your body toward the core while leaving your appendages out in the dark. Now, the second main function of response, this is essentially what it sounds like. With that sensory information, whether internal or external, forming the appropriate response to all that information. It can be, say, motor functions such as walking or even peristalsis of allowing the involuntary movements of food down your digestive tract. That peristalsis does involve the nervous system. And well, the response can be voluntary or involuntary. Integration is essentially integrating information of sensations, as well as, say, memories, stored memories, your current emotional state, and even cognition or learning. For example, say you, as a young child, see a stove that's turned on, and the child touches that stove, and then they essentially, through sensory information of the hand, the nervous system can tell that the stove is very hot, and then forms a response to move away from the stove. And then, ideally, combining your emotional state of maybe momentary pain of the heat and storing that as a memory to not do that again. That is an example of just integrating information from many sources that the nervous system will do. Now, the second main function of the nervous system, which is controlling the body, this is typically broken down into two subtypes of the nervous system, one being the somatic nervous system. And this one is responsible for conscious perception and voluntary motor responses. Now, voluntary, not necessarily in the typical way it's being said. Voluntary means simply contractions or movements of the skeletal muscle, not necessarily voluntary as in if you want to lift your hands and you lift your hand, you thought that. But say, for example, a voluntary motion, but not in the typical definition of voluntary. Say you were walking along the trail and your eyes catch a snake crawling across the path. Your body will jerk backwards away from the snake. You didn't force yourself to move backwards from that frightening stimulus, but your somatic nervous system did interpret the information to do that voluntary motion, that voluntary motor response. So that's an example of that is still considered voluntary motion, but not necessarily that you yourself chose to do. And the autonomic nervous system. Well, that is responsible for true involuntary control of the body, which is not the movement of the skeletal structure, but more internal processes such as maintaining homeostasis. For example, say the body is under too much stress, then certain hormones would be released to help bring a more calm state down. Or if going back into temperature, if your body is noticing that thermal homeostasis or proper maintenance of heat throughout the body is in jeopardy, the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, will start telling your body to focus blood flow into the core of your body to maintain heat around the important organs, whereas blood flow will then start leaving the digits in your arms and legs. So, autonomic nervous system, by involuntary control of the body, that's maintaining, say, chemical processes or the more internal functions of the body. Whereas the somatic nervous system, that controls conscious perception and voluntary motion, or essentially the movement of skeletal muscle to move the skeleton around. Whether you will yourself to do it or you did it without quote unquote thinking about it. Now, another subtype of controlling the body, as far as the nervous system goes, not a lot of people will talk about the enteric nervous system, but it does get brought up occasionally. So just so that it's understood what that is, the enteric nervous system is responsible for controlling the smooth muscle and glandular tissue in the digestive system. It is not dependent on the central nervous system. This functions this can function separate of the nervous system. And examples of what the enteric nervous system does is, say, receiving information of is there a proper chemical balance in parts of the body, or the movement of electrolytes, or, well, water in the gut. Essentially, peristalsis and the digestive system, that does have its own enteric nervous system, as opposed to being completely dependent on the central nervous system. And this is just a image that outlines the main and the sub ways of looking at the nervous systems. CNS meaning the central nervous system, which would be the brain and the spinal column. The peripheral nervous system, which is essentially the ganglia and the nerves, or the cell bodies and the axons outside the central nervous system. And then the enteric nervous system, which is effectively the main nervous system of the digestive tract. Which, it's good that the digestive tract has its own partition of the central nervous system. That way it can appropriately respond to, well, it can quickly respond to, say, is it time to absorb? Is something that the body needs to absorb currently in the small intestines? Then okay, time to start absorbing. Or is there a danger in the is there a danger in the digestive tract? Well, time to respond accordingly. And, well, we'll go more into other types of medical techniques, but we'll look at MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. It's a way of producing a very clear picture of the nervous system. For example, taking the brain. MRI, it only looks at the the physical structural layout of whatever is being observed. And a bonus of MRI is that this can be done without X-ray radiation. Essentially, radio waves are what are used to analyze different parts of the nervous system. Now, another technique that scans and only looks for structural information, the physical layout of, say, your brain, well, that's computed tomography. or a CT scan, a CAT scan. These effectively create images of cross sections of the body, and unlike MRI, which uses radio wave and magnetic radiation, a CT scan uses X-ray radiation. And sometimes a contrast material is used to help distinguish certain portions of what is being scanned so that it can be distinguished from other portions. A contrast agent basically makes some parts show up brighter or darker on a CT scan than other parts. And I'm going to say it once again, MRI and CT scans, that only will give a medical professional physical structural information, the physical layout of, say, the brain. Positron emission tomography, PET scans, these give much different information. Essentially, what a PET scan does is it tells the analyzer functional information, say whether different parts of the brain have a lot of biochemical activity going on, or other parts there's not a lot of activity or function happening, like the uptake of minerals, nutrients, versus other parts that might be dead, therefore there's no functional activity occurring. And well, what these do is that essentially to put it in layman's terms, a PET scan will help a medical professional tell if organs and tissues are working, if they're actually doing activity, chemical activity. And this technique usually involves the injection of a radio tracer, which gives off chemical radiation. And, well, we'll get into some pros and cons of these three techniques. PET scan, it's the only one of the three that were talked about that gives functional activity information, whether that part of the body is currently functioning, or there's any activity, or there are parts of, say, the brain that are much less active than other parts, or less active or more active than what is quote unquote normal. And well, it involves the injection of a radio tracer, which usually contains glucose, which could prevent this particular type of imaging being done on, say, someone who is diabetic. And it is also the most costly of the three imaging techniques. MRI is much better at giving structural information. It gives a much better picture of the structural layout than a CT scan will do. But it also requires more time and money to do. And while it is beneficial in that it is non-invasive, there's no injection, but this does involve sticking a person into a large magnet, and say that person, if they have claustrophobia, then that can cause it to become difficult for that person to undergo a MRI scan, as well as the fact that spinning a large magnet is very noisy. And CT scan, which compared to an MRI, a CT scan will also give structural information, but to a much lower quality. It is the most quickest and least expensive. So if, say, that's something you need to worry about when it comes to cost of insurance, CT scan is a much simpler, quicker option. And least expensive, typically non-invasive. But what's really cool is that these techniques can actually be combined. So, for example, if a medical professional wants to look at both structure and function of the brain, then and they want to do it in a less costly way, they might do a CT PET scan, which essentially takes a CT scan and a PET scan, and a medical professional can use both information to say, look at the PET scan to determine what parts of the brain are functioning, have healthy activity, what parts might not be showing activity when they should or showing too much activity. And then the CT scan can give some structural information. For example, if the PET scan shows some parts of the brain not showing a lot of activity, then the CT scan might show that part of the brain partly damaged or a lot of blockage. Whereas if there's a lot of activity showing up where it typically wouldn't in a PET scan, maybe the structure might show up in a CT scan as well. And the best scenario, though very costly, the best scenario, a medical professional might decide that a CT scan along with a PET scan might not give a clear enough picture of what should be looked at. Well, then the doctor might decide to do an MRI-PET scan, which essentially the MRI portion will give clear structural information, where the PET scan will still give very clear information on the activity of the brain. So these techniques can be combined appropriately, which is undoubtedly very cool. And that concludes this video. We will get into some other ways of scanning. So just a little bit past the 32-minute mark, it is a pleasure to have you all for this online experience of Bio 130. Catch you all in the next video. Oh, and yes, there will be a discussion activity. It's just not written into the slide.